Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of Rios 2016. We will provide an overview of the changes between this version of the standard and the previous version, which was Rios 2006. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on the slide to give you an idea of what we'll be covering today. And just before we get started, I want to mention that any questions you have at any point throughout the presentation, you may type them into the questions field in the GoToWebinar taskbar, and we will save those for the end. So again, at any point in the presentation, go ahead and type your questions in, and we will save time at the end of the presentation to go through any questions you might have. Also, a recording of today's webinar will be made available on PGR's website sometime in the next day or two on PGR's website. And we also will post a copy of just the slides in case you would like to reference them after the presentation is over. Again, within the next day or two, those will be available on PGR's website. So we'll talk a little bit about PJR, the benefits and drivers for certification. We'll talk about the transition timeline that was associated with Rios 2016. We will look at the key changes at a high level and then go into a more detailed clause by clause overview of the changes in Rios 2016. We will close the presentation with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is being certified or pursuing certification for the first time and not as familiar with what that process looks like. And again, as I mentioned, we'll close with questions at the end. PGR is a leading registrar. We have a long list of countries to which we have certified to various standards. This is not an all-inclusive list, just a couple examples to give you an idea of our global presence. PGR is accredited to grant certification for a variety of standards, including Rios, which we are covering today. In case you are looking to have an integrated management system or have already pursued certification to other standards, some of these may look familiar to you. Someone had posted a question about audio. I'm just checking to see if there are issues on the audio front, but we'll keep going in the meantime. I'm hoping that everyone else can hear me. So at a high level, for a standard like Rios, which covers quality, environmental health, and safety subjects, the benefits of certification include improving the organization's quality, environmental health, and safety performance, as well as minimizing risk. Okay, it seems like some people can hear us, so we're going to keep going with the presentation. And again, the slides will be made available for anyone who had issues or wants to reference them and wants to review them after the fact. If you're not able to hear any of the audio, make sure that you are connected. We can see on the attendance panel that you might not be connected to the audio, so you might want to look at that on your end. Other people are able to hear. Okay, anyway. Other benefits to certification include material sourcing and outsourcing controls, management commitment and employee engagement benefits. Certification can provide a competitive advantage. It can also improve public image, depending on the industry, depending on the certification. Okay, I apologize for the disruption. Someone is having issues with their audio. Okay, let's continue. There are potential financial benefits beyond improvements to public image and competitive advantage. In some industries, certain standards may have reduction in insurance premiums, for example. The standard and the certification provides a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. It also represents a commitment to the responsible management of recyclables. For anyone who is familiar, who was certified to Rios 2006 and was upgrading to Rios 2016, the deadline to transition has passed. I left this slide in here. We've been conducting this webinar for a while now. I did leave the slide in here just to reiterate to anyone who might have missed the window for some reason. That deadline to transition has passed. If you have not transitioned, you'll be looking to get certified all over again to the new standard instead of transitioning at this point. As is common with standard transitions, a deadline is set by which the audit needs to take place to prevent a lapse in certification. And again, that has already passed. If you are looking to obtain a copy of the standard, I do have an email address included in this slide that you can utilize to go ahead and purchase a copy of that or get that process rolling. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but in general, standards are revised for a variety of reasons, maintaining market relevance, ensuring that they continue to be compatible with other standards that might also have been revised, ensuring that they continue to be easy to use, easy to implement, again, to integrate with other standards as well, that they sufficiently cover the required topics, they continue to be flexible to be applied to a variety of industries and sectors and different sized organizations, and continue to be easy to understand, free of ambiguous language, easy to translate, things like that. Some of the key changes in Rios 2016 compared to Rios 2006 include an emphasis on leadership, a greater emphasis on leadership, a focus on proactivity and risk management, an emphasis on the outcomes of the management system, and we'll talk more about these as we get into the further into the slides. There are changes to the communication and awareness requirements, including for stakeholders and customers. And change management is another key change in Rios 2016. I'm not going to go through the terms, but I did include them in the slides, some of the key term changes. So you can find these within the standard and review them on your own time, or again, reference the slides and review them in more detail. These are not all the terms, but some of the key term changes associated with Rios 2016. Okay, so at this point in the presentation, we will look at the clauses found in the standard. And I should note that we may not cover every single clause. If there was not a significant change, we're not going to be focusing on it today. We're looking at the changes between Rios 2006 and Rios 2016 primarily today. So the introduction of the standard contains some notes and additional guidance, but is not auditable. So we'll start with clause 1, which covers general requirements. Within the scope and application requirements, the organization must consider actions by outside providers in the scope. So you can take a look at the definition for outside providers to get some clarification there. It's capitalized since that is a proper term in the standard and can be referenced there for more information. And the footprint should include activities performed by outside providers. An example of an outside provider is a contractor, but that is not the only type of outside provider that your industry or your organization may be working with. So again, familiarize yourself with that term if you are not already familiar with it, to ensure that all relevant outside providers have been identified and considered. Rios Outcomes is an entirely new section for Rios 2016, and it outlines the implementation criteria, the intended outcomes for the standard, and calls for proactivity. And this is one of the key changes we mentioned, and you will see the tone of proactivity throughout the standard. This is one of the key changes, encouraging and requiring organizations pursuing certification to Rios 2016 to be more proactive. And we will talk more about that throughout the presentation. Regarding infrastructure, the requirements for assigning responsibilities can be found in clause 1.2.1 through 1.2.3, including the assignment of a management representative. What's important here, or most important here, I should say, is that senior management commitment, involvement, and accountability are emphasized, and it's their responsibility to ensure that adequate resources are available for the organization in order for the management system to meet its intended outcomes. So you might have a management representative who is responsible for a variety of tasks, but ultimately management is accountable for the intended outcomes of the management system being met, for the assignment of resources or the adequacy of resources. They are ultimately accountable. This is another one of those key changes we talked about. For clause 1.3, document and record keeping controls, this looks a little bit different. And for anyone who has seen the changes in ISO 9001 2015 or ISO 14001 2015, you're already going to be familiar with some of these changes. The documentation system changes are similar to those standard revisions in that controlled documents can take many forms, and the verbiage in the standard is more flexible to allow for each organization to determine what media makes the most sense for them when it comes to documents and records, and some of the terminology has changed accordingly. Clause 2 covers the policy. There are some additional requirements related to the evaluation of impacts and risks, annual reviews, senior management commitment, etc. So those are just a couple examples. You'll want to look a little more carefully at this section in the standard to understand how some of those requirements have changed. Clause 3 focuses on planning. 3.1 specifically focuses on identifying the Rios footprint. Again, you see a tone of proactivity in the verbiage used in this section. For the organization is required to proactively plan. These assessments need to include purchasing, source material acquisition, transport, delivery, etc. It's to include both positive and negative aspects, impacts, relationships, not just focusing on the negative. It's to be kept up to date, reviewed for changes, and assessed prior to making changes that could impact the quality environmental health and safety management system. So again, this is proactive planning. And that's a big part of this last bullet point, to assess prior to making changes that could impact the management system. So instead of reacting to some type of impact on the system after a change has been made, the idea is that you are proactively reviewing the impact a change could have on the management system to determine whether it's a good idea, what changes might need to be made to the management system, such as operational controls or training or PPE, whatever the case may be, proactively before that change is made. This is really important. 3.1.1 represents an entirely new section requiring the identification and control of risks affecting product and/or service quality. So if we look at the terms and definitions, risk is the effect of uncertainty and can be positive or negative. Some examples of quality risks might include employee theft, ineffective training, departure of key personnel, equipment or tool breakdown. Those are just a couple examples, but this is important to evaluate, again, proactively, to cover the quality part of the QEHSMS, which is the Quality Environmental Health and Safety Management System required by Rios. 3.1.2 and 3.1.3 represent the environmental and health and safety equivalents, respectively, of that 3.1.1 quality risk section. So similarly, you're to proactively identify environmental impacts and health and safety risks. And these sections include additional requirements for each of those, including the documentation of rating criteria for environmental impacts and the documentation of controls for health and safety risks. 3.1.4 focuses on legal requirements. Above and beyond legal requirements that were already required in Rios 2006, this also includes any product requirements that might be applicable. This may not apply to every industry or every organization, but as applicable, product requirements also need to be included. Any controls associated with meeting legal and other requirements is to be documented. And again, you have some flexibility as to how you document them specifically, but how you are controlling for those requirements is required to be documented by Rios 2016. .1.5 covers product, service, and customer requirements. This is also an entirely new section, and it requires the documentation of requirements and monitoring methodologies for products, customer requirements, outsourced activities, source material specifications, etc. It also requires verification and records of conformity. 3.1.6 covers other stakeholder requirements. So these sections work in conjunction with 3.1.4, which we just talked about on the last slide, covering legal requirements. So they combined, they represent legal and other requirements. The other stakeholder requirements includes the need to identify who the stakeholders are and what their respective requirements might be. Not all stakeholders will have requirements, but you need to go through the process of identifying who the stakeholders are and what, if any, requirements they may have to understand what controls are necessary in order to meet those requirements. So as I mentioned, after you've identified the stakeholders and their requirements, controls are to be implemented accordingly. These should be reviewed annually. And for clarification, you can take a look at the stakeholder definition. Some less obvious examples might include owners of the company, landlords, insurance companies, etc., who may have requirements of their own. 3.2 covers improvement planning, excuse me. 3.2.1 focuses on establishing the goals. There are several inputs to be considered when working on establishing the goals, and they need to be considered, not necessarily included, but they need to be considered. And you can check out 3.2.1 for that list. 3.2.2 covers plans for goal achievement. There are written plans required, identifying what the tasks are, any resource needs, how responsibilities are assigned, any due dates, and methods for evaluating the results. So it's not enough just to establish what the goal will be. You have to have a written plan for how the goal will be achieved and how it will be measured. 3.3 represents change management, and as I mentioned earlier, this represents a proactive tone in the standard and is an entirely new requirement for Rios 2016. The verbiage is very clear versus previous versions of Rios and other standards. You can also find this change management concept very clearly in ISO 45001 2018 for anyone who is familiar with that new standard for health and safety as well. So the concept of change management, as I mentioned earlier, is the proactive planning of how a change could affect the management system before it's implemented, to ensure that adequate training and controls are in place instead of reactively adjusting or reacting to incidents or near misses, injuries, spills, anything that might happen as a result of not having gone through this planning process and making the necessary changes to the system before the change is introduced. And this includes specifically reviewing the footprint for any relevant changes before the change is made. Clause 4 focuses on implementation of the standard requirements. 4.1.1 covers competence, and some of the requirements include identifying competency requirements, maintaining records as evidence of competence, and verifying effectiveness of the competency. If you have had to do any training or take any action to close those competency gaps, then you need to verify effectiveness of those actions. Training is to consider the identified criteria. And all of this, the competency requirements, is as relevant to the impact on the intended outcomes of the management system. So some job descriptions or titles may have a greater or lesser impact on the intended outcomes of the management system. So this is as relevant to that impact. And as I mentioned, this will vary by job title or individual employee. Just depends on their ability to impact that intended outcomes of the management system. There are additional awareness topics and requirements that can be found in clause 4.1.2. And clause 4.2, which focuses on communication, has some additional documentation requirements for its communication plan requirements. And again, you can review those in more detail in clause 4.2. 4.2 is broken down into subclauses focusing on different types of communications. 4.2.2 covers customer communications, including customer qualifications if there are any, as well as any quality, environmental, health, and safety customer requirements. 4.2.3 focuses on supplier communication, communication of source control requirements, load rejections, errors, etc. Outside supplier communication is covered in 4.2.4. It replaces the old contractor communication section, which was in the previous version of Rios, and it also contains some clarified language. 4.2.5 covers external communication, which requires communication of relevant QEHS information with visitors, stakeholders, etc. Some examples of quality, environmental, health, and safety information that might need to be shared with visitors or stakeholders may include emergency plans, reporting on-site chemicals to the fire department, Tier 2 level chemical reporting. Those are just a couple examples. 4.3 focuses on operational controls. 4.3.1 as a clause is restructured. It focuses on source materials, and this previously would have been found under the suppliers section of Rios 2006. It contains clarified requirements and expanded controls, again compared to Rios 2006. 4.3.2 covers outsourced providers, products, and services. Again, this is restructured and these sections have been moved around. In Rios 2006, this would have been found under the contractors section. 4.3.2 includes additional requirements similar to purchasing controls, such as documented specifications, controls relative to the potential quality, environmental, health, and safety impact, records of evaluation, and records of monitoring as a couple examples. 4.4 is a new section focusing on quality controls, requiring documentation of specifications and requirements, any worker instructions, etc. Similar to the quality control section of 4.4, 4.5 and 4.6 cover environmental and health and safety controls respectively. These are new sections, very similar. They require documented controls to minimize environmental impacts. And then 4.6 requires documented controls to minimize health and safety hazards. This includes hazards related to outsourcing, source materials, contractors, offsite activities, chemicals, equipment, etc. There are no significant changes in the emergency preparedness requirements. These are found in clause 4.7. I do want to make a connection though to the communication requirements in clause 4.2. Again, this Rios 2016 has an emphasis on communication or some changes to the communication requirements, and we talked about that as one of the key changes. So while there are no significant changes to the emergency preparedness concept, I just want to make that connection between the communication requirements of 4.2 and how that can relate to emergency preparedness response plans, the need to communicate them. Clause 5 covers checking and corrective action. 5.1 focuses on monitoring and measurement, and there are some additional items here to be included in the monitoring and measurement plan for the QEHSMS. The subclause 5.1.1, there are some additional items to be monitored. 5.1.2 requires annual evaluation of legal and stakeholder requirements to assess compliance. And there's some changed verbiage or additional verbiage about the competency requirements for who would be conducting that compliance evaluation. Whether it's one person or a team, make sure that whoever is evaluating the compliance meets those competency requirements found in 5.1.2. And you'll need evidence of them having those competency requirements met. For 5.1.3, which focuses on maintenance and calibration of monitoring equipment, there are some additional requirements found here. Some examples include documentation of requirements and actions taken to address out-of-tolerance monitoring devices. So this was not in Rios 2006. That is in 5.1.3. For 5.1.4, analysis of monitoring and measurement results, monitoring and measuring outputs are inputs to the management review. So you've got a list of inputs and outputs required for the management review, and you can find monitoring and measuring outputs on the list of things that needs to be included in the management review. .2 covers nonconformance and both corrective and preventive actions. 5.2.2 is a new section titled EH&S Incident Investigations. It requires investigation for all EHS incidents. And you can take a look at the definition for incidents. That would be important for this concept because it includes near misses. A lot of people will assume that an incident is when an injury occurred or damage was done, but an incident can include a near miss where someone almost got hurt or damage was almost caused, the potential was there, and had the circumstances been different, that damage could have been done. Previous NCRs for 2 audit cycles will be reviewed for effectiveness instead of just 1 cycle as was previously required. And this is another change for Rios 2016. So to put that greater emphasis on the corrective action process and its effectiveness, we'll be looking back 2 years instead of just 1 to assess how effective those corrective actions were. Have there been reoccurrences of the same issues, or is that corrective action process strong? And there's a note here about the transition and recertification audits for Rios 2016. All NCRs, even minors, require evidence of effective implementation prior to acceptance and closure per the Rios 2016 transition requirements. So these transition requirements came out in conjunction with the Rios 2016 standard, and all certification bodies are required to meet these requirements. So this trickles down to our clients in that, again, 2 cycles worth of previous NCRs will be reviewed. And when we are looking for your responses to nonconformities, your transition audit should already have occurred, so that one should be irrelevant. But going forward, recertification audits to Rios 2016, we will not be able to accept a correction and corrective action written in the future tense. Typically for a minor, you have a year to implement your correction and corrective action plan. But for recertification audits, they have to already be implemented, just like our process currently handles major nonconformities. And this will not apply to surveillance audits, only recertification audits. .3 focuses on internal Rios audits, internal audits to the Rios standard. And this requires annual audits with full system evaluations prior to certification or recertification. So that verbiage is different. A reminder, an important reminder to make sure your internal audit is conducted and completed before your third-party audit. When PJR comes to do your audit, that the outputs of the internal audit are really important to our audit process and our assessment of whether your management system is meeting the requirements of the standard. So now it is written right into the standard that you'll need to make sure your audit is conducted prior to your certification or recertification audits. Ideally, it would be completed before your audit every year, but it will be especially important during the initial certification audit and the recertification audit. There are also some additional written plan details and requirements related to how the internal audit criteria are to be met. So take a look at clause 5.3 for some information on that. Clause 6 covers management review. There is some revised verbiage to the inputs and outputs to provide some clarification where it was found to be needed. No significant changes there, but the verbiage has changed. So it's a section that you'll want to review. Okay. So for anyone pursuing certification for the first time, we're going to spend a minute or two going over what that process looks like. So as I mentioned earlier on one of the first slides in the presentation, you'll need to purchase a copy of the standard, and that can be done by contacting Michelle Woody via email. You'll also need to establish all of the quality, environmental, health, and safety management system documentation that you'll need in order to meet the Rios 2016 standard requirements. You'll need to conduct training to those requirements and implement those requirements, including conducting an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and your management review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. For initial certification, you will be completing a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit, addressing any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. The stage 1 and stage 2 audits combine to represent our registration process. So the stage 1 audit is a documentation review to evaluate the readiness of your organization to have its stage 2 audit. Do you have the documentation framework in place? Does it generally meet the requirements of the standard so that you are not proceeding to the stage 2 phase, which is longer and more expensive if you're not ready? Stage 2 is a on-site audit of the entire management system, all of its processes, all its shifts, to ensure that the system is effectively implemented, meeting the requirements of the standard. And if there are any nonconformities, those need to be resolved through the corrective action process prior to the issuance of a certificate. Once a certificate is issued, you will be put on a surveillance audit cycle. Those can be annual or semi-annual depending on your contract. And those represent partial system audits. Unlike a stage 2, we don't have to cover all of the processes or all of the shifts. It will be a sampling. Those audits can also result in nonconformities. On the 3rd year of the 3-year cycle, it will be a recertification audit, which is very similar to the stage 2. It covers all of the processes, all of the shifts. And again, nonconformities need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. And then your cycle continues, 2 years worth of surveillance audits and another recertification audit. So again, this does not apply to companies who transitioned from Rios 2006 to Rios 2016 before the deadline. This is just an overview of that certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time. Okay. If you have not already, please go ahead and type any questions you might have into the question field. And in the meantime, I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen. If you have technical questions that you'd like to discuss offline, if you have questions about your upcoming audit or questions in the future, you can go ahead and contact myself. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager. I can be reached through PGR's main number or via email. And we also have an EHS program manager, Stacy DeSantis. I have her email address on the screen as well. If you are a new client looking for a quote to pursue certification, I also have the phone number for our sales department who can help you get that quote process going. So let's see if we have any questions. Okay, we have a question. Is this presentation for the ISO 9001 standard? Nope, and it looks like that gentleman left. This was for the for Rios 2016. Looks like we were having some audio issues. I apologize. We will post the slides. We will post the recording of today's webinar On the off chance it was an issue on your end and not ours, the recording should hopefully have all of the audio. And if you missed a particular section and have any questions, Larry, please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone. Okay. Does PJR have planned lead auditor training to certify contracted auditors in the classroom or online for Rios 2016 anytime soon, 2020 or early 2021? I will have to look into that, Alice. If you would like to send me an email so I have your contact information, I can look into that and get back to you. At this time, I'm not sure, but if that's something that is needed or that we've offered in the past and we need to update it to Rios 2016, then hopefully that's something that we can get going. So I'm going to jot that down for myself. And if you could send me an email so I know who to follow up with, that would be great. Thanks for your question. Again, I apologize for any audio issues we might have had. Hopefully the recording came out okay. Is there a reduction in audit time during the certification audit if the organization is certified to ISO 14001 and 45001? Do these organizations need either stage 1 or stage 2? And why would an organization choose this standard and have certified other EMS or OSAS? Okay, so there are several questions in there. Let's take them one at a time. Is there a reduction in audit time for a certification audit if you have multiple standards? The answer to that question is sometimes. There are integration discounts that can be provided to audit time. In some cases, it depends on the level of integration and the specific standards. So if you are a new client and you are looking for a quote, or if you are looking to add a standard, this would be part of our evaluation of how much audit time is needed. So certainly in some cases, the audit time can be reduced due to integration. Next question is about whether a stage 1 or stage 2 audit would be needed. I'm not sure I understand if you're asking if you're already certified to 14 and 45 and you're adding Rios. When you are adding a new standard, we do start with the stage 1 and stage 2. Again, sometimes there are time discounts if it's an integrated system. If you are adding all of those standards at once, you would certainly need a stage 1 and stage 2. But these would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis with your salesperson and your scheduler and the team who calculates audit time. So we can talk offline as well with your specific questions, and if I can't answer them, I can help put you in touch with someone who can. Last question in here, why would an organization choose the standard and have certified? Again, I'm not totally clear on the question. Please send me an email if I'm not answering your questions clearly. But compared to 14001 and either OSAS 18001 or ISO 45001, the main difference with Rios is that it also includes quality. So it focuses on recycling of metals and plastics and different material, but it also includes the quality aspect that neither 14001 or 45001 include. So that is one of the main differences between Rios and the environmental and health and safety standards. It also is sometimes easier for an organization to maintain certification just to Rios, since it's one standard in and of itself, compared to adding 14001, a health and safety standard, and maybe even the quality standard 9001 together to represent quality, environmental, health, and safety. It really varies by industry. There are some fees associated with Rios requiring a Rios membership and a licensing fee that the other standards you are talking about don't have. So it's a trade-off as far as audit time and cost. That's really something that your salesperson can talk through in more detail, or your scheduler. But again, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call if you want to talk about this more offline. Okay, there's a question about my email. So if you're still on the webinar, my email is right on the screen right here. I have it up during answering questions. So my email is amatthews with 2 T's at pjr.com. So go ahead and shoot me an email if you have any additional questions. Someone has their hand up, but that does not tell me what your question is. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. I'll hang out for another minute or two. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time. I hope if you have already transitioned, that your audit went well. If you are pursuing certification in the near future to Rios 2016, I hope today's webinar was helpful. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have as you work through Rios 2016. Thank you and have a great day.